In part one, we introduced Robin Collins's argument for the existence of God based on contemporary science. And the argument went roughly like this, that fine-tuning is improbable. The fine-tuning of the universe is improbable under atheism, but it's likely under theism. And so we have, with our prime principle of confirmation, the idea that when we're considering these two different hypotheses, we have observations that count in preference of the one that is more likely given that hypothesis. And so that was the idea that the fine-tuning gives us reason to think that there is a designer of the universe, and of course, the designer is God. Okay, so part two here, let's get going with objections. First objection of many that we're going to cover. Breaking this into two parts because the response is similar to both parts. First, there might be some more fundamental law that causes the other laws to be as they are. Well, the idea there is kind of ad hoc, says Collins. Why would you think that? We don't know of any more fundamental law. And so it seems to be just a suggestion in order to get out of the premises of the argument. And besides, even if it were true, it just moves the improbability up one level, right? Why would such a more fundamental law exist that causes the laws to be like they are? You could still run the same argument, the design argument, even if this were true. So that does not seem to be a very strong premise. This second way of presenting this sometimes is, I've heard people say, this obviously Collins has as well, that the laws are logically necessary. Now, again, this clearly looks ad hoc, right? Why would you say that? There aren't any logical principles there that seem to make them logically necessary. And again, even if they were logically necessary the way that they are, it seems like, again, you're just trying to move the argument up one level, but the argument would still work at that level. Okay, second objection. As far as we know, there might be other types of life that could exist in different conditions. Now here, Collins says, notice that the argument doesn't presuppose that all life has to be like us, just intelligent, right? We're looking for a universe capable of supporting intelligent life. Now, further, I would add, and this is not something from Collins, that, well, wait a minute, recall when we said we had these minimal necessary requirements for living organisms to exist, and the argument is based on that. Even if you don't allow for intelligent life, you have to have a universe that would allow beings like us to exist. You have to have, in order to have that, you have to have the universe that allows life to exist. And so that requires that extreme fine-tuning in order for that to occur. And so it really doesn't matter what kind of living organisms you are considering, they have to have those minimal requirements, and that's highly unlikely without some design, is the argument. Okay, third objection. If the laws of nature weren't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here to ponder this fact. So the idea is, well, wait a minute. Of course, you know, they might be fine-tuned. We're here. We made it. We won the lottery. Of course, they're fine-tuned for us to exist because we exist. Now, Collins presents a response that goes back to Richard Swinburne and others, where he says, well, wait, think about a firing squad analogy. So the idea is you are in front of a firing squad for whatever reason, obviously unjustly placed there. And in this firing squad, instead of 10 members or 6 members, there are 50, all in a semicircle, all near semicircle around you. And they are marksmen. They are well-trained, all of them trained to hit your heart. And they're all aiming at your heart. And they all fire and then you're there still. They all missed. Now, what do you think after you survived this? Do you think, well, no big deal. I wouldn't be here to question this if I didn't survive, so nothing unusual just happened. No, of course not. There requires an explanation. You have to have an explanation of why that happened. It makes no sense to simply say, if they hadn't missed, I wouldn't be here, because a rational person knows that there had to be some intent to miss, right? Somebody paid them off, or it was all just psychological torture, whatever. There was some explanation as to why they all missed. And so there are situations that don't require an explanation. So there are differences between some things that are extremely improbable, but yet still mundane. That those happen, okay, that happen. But then there are other circumstances in which they are extremely improbable, but they require an explanation. The firing squad is of the latter type. The nature of the universe is of the latter type. And so there's a way to distinguish these two cases. And in fact, I've written an article on this called Mundane or Incredible, identifying when an explanation is required. Published in the American Philosophical Quarterly. Maybe I'll make a video about that someday. We need not go into the details, but it's widely recognized that there are distinctions between two kinds of cases. All right, fourth objection. Somebody might say, well, wait a minute, who designed God? Right? So in fact, this is something that Richard Dawkins has said in response to this argument. Well, if the universe is amazingly complex and calls for a designer, then whatever designed the universe would also have to be amazingly complex and designed by some other being. Okay, wait a minute. First of all, and most importantly for Collins, it doesn't hinder the effectiveness of the argument as it is proposed. It's still more probable that we would have fine-tuning in the way that we have it under theism than under atheism. So the argument still works. This really doesn't undermine the argument. So consider the Martian biosphere that Collins described. Would it undermine our conclusion that the biosphere was designed just because we think that whatever designed it was also designed? Of course not. We still would conclude it's designed. Now, there is I think, a even better response, a more developed response that is available that's related to perfect being theology of the kind that Aquinas does, but that's taking us way too far afield from this argument. So let's go on with the fifth objection. And the fifth objection is one of the biggest. Now, this is one that most people who think the design argument works in the way that Collins presents agree that this seems to be the most reasonable objection to the argument. What if there are many universes? What if there is actually a multiverse, as has become more and more common in science fiction? And the idea there is if there were many universes, now you would have to have nearly infinitely many. I mean, if it's finite, it has to be a really, really large amount of universes, trillions upon trillions, quadrillions upon quadrillions, right? If that were the case, then it wouldn't be unlikely that there's a universe capable of supporting life. Now, here, Collins seems to agree that this is correct. Yes, this is true. If there were many, many universes, then it would not be unlikely that there's a universe capable of supporting life. Now, Timothy O'Connor takes this objection in a very different direction. Maybe I'll talk about his response some other time. But Collins says, look, okay, let's think about how this might work. There are two basic possibilities for how this many worlds hypothesis would work. One of them is the idea that you have some kind of pre-existing superspace that generates quantum fluctuations, and that produces universes of various kinds. Okay, it's kind of like a universe producing machine, Collins says elsewhere. Or maybe our universe is one of a series of oscillating universes. So this is the idea of there's a big bang, and then there's a big crunch, and then a big bang, and then a big crunch. And most of the time, these universes don't even last a second, let alone billions of years. They just, and they're gone. But that's what happens. All right. So how does Collins respond to this objection? There are a couple different ways of responding to it from Collins' view. He says, first of all, we should prefer the simpler hypothesis, ceteris paribus. Now, people use that idea. What seems simpler is sometimes a matter of perspective. For Collins, it just seems ad hoc to add this additional thing that we know nothing about that gives us a universe generator, right? Without any external reasons to think there are many universes. There's no scientific support currently for many universes. Now I know some physicists like Kaku like to talk about the many universes. So there are physicists who talk about this and maybe how it could possibly work, but it's all hypothesis that really isn't based in physics. When that's what Kaku does sometimes. He does philosophy and kind of ties it back to relating to some physics, but there's no physics that says that we should conclude that there are many universes. That's not the case, certainly not with our contemporary physics that we have now. And Collins says, look, you could compare this response to somebody who's a dinosaur skeptic, someone who doesn't think that dinosaurs exist or ever existed, and you point out through dinosaur bones and fossils and so on, and they say, well, you know, as yet there's this undiscovered, this unexplained dinosaur bone producing field. And that's what there is. So it just produces dinosaur bones, but, you know, there were never actually any dinosaurs. Well, that would be crazy. You're just ad hoc. You're just sticking to your idea regardless and then creating some crazy hypothesis to avoid the force of the argument that there are dinosaurs. Collins says the same thing is going on here when you're proposing multiple universes. And in order to support that simpler hypothesis idea, we know of designers, right? So Collins says, look, we're familiar with designers. We're not familiar with some kind of external universe generating process. And so it's natural to conclude that there's a designer under certain circumstances. So for example, we have SETI investigations, right? Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And this is a serious scientific endeavor. We have scientific methods of trying to identify radio waves that were unnatural, maybe if they're somehow in the signaling prime numbers, for example, something like that. That would be a very odd and unnatural thing. So we would expect if we found that, that would give us reason to think there is some extraterrestrial intelligence creating it. Anyway, that's a legitimate kind of way of thinking about things, that there are designers and there are things that are designed. And so it fits in with the way we already do science. All right, a second response to the many universes hypothesis is that whatever it is that causes the many universes to exist is also unlikely on an atheistic hypothesis. It's even more unlikely on an atheistic hypothesis. The universe generator of any type has characteristics of design. Okay, it has to be governed by complex laws that allow it to produce multiple types of universes. And so even if there were multiple universes, the argument would still work based on whatever's generating those multiple universes, whatever makes the multiple universes exist, right? So with that universe generators that we're speculating about, if things were slightly different, then that generator wouldn't produce the many universes of such great variety that are proposed on this idea. So that does not seem to be a reasonable path to take to object to the argument. And then finally, obviously Collins is taking this objection seriously, but he has a third response to it, and that is that the many universes hypothesis can't explain many other aspects of the universe that do indicate design. Not only are the laws that we're familiar with, the laws of nature, such that they allow living organisms exist, they don't merely meet those minimal requirements that we talked about, but they have an extraordinary degree of beauty, of elegance, of harmony. Einstein thought this, Weinberg thought this, prominent other physicists think this, mathematicians who do physics as well. You know, when you're doing that high level of physics, a lot of people talk about the elegance of the way the laws of nature fit together. And Collins says that's just another indication of a creation of design that we have. Now, Collins has much more to say about this, as I mentioned previously, so he goes into a lot more technical details than I've covered here, but those are his responses to potential objections to this argument.